Welcome to the Quack and Roll podcast. I am your host, Quack Pui Lan. Today, I am going to interview Sister Mary John Menanzon from the Philippines. She is a missionary Benedictine nun and a pioneer of Asian feminist theology. She is an activist, theologian, educator, and author. She co-founded Gabriela, a federation of women's organizations in the Philippines, and served as its chairperson for 18 years. In this episode, we are going to learn about the development of Asian feminist theology and what inspired Sister Mary John to become a leader in education, religious communities, and society. Welcome to the podcast, Sister Mary John.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me, Wilan.
Mary John, I met you many years ago in Sukabumi, Indonesia in 1981 when we had one of our first Asian women's theological meeting. You were the keynote speaker. Can you share with us how did Asian feminist theology begin?
I have to start from the mother organization, so to say. That's the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians. There were theologians from Asia who were studying in Europe and America, and they were saying, what we are studying here in Europe and America, how do we put that into practice in our Asian countries? So they said, we have to make it relevant. And that is when they started to make what they call theology from below, not from above. So that is how they started the Ecumenical Association of Third World Theologians. So we were a part of that, but there was no feminist counterpart yet. Now, what we noticed, we women in that ITWOT, that even these male theologians are very progressive politically, but they were also gender blind. We can see that, for example, when all the main speakers were male, whenever we have a general conference, all the males are the main speaker and the women will just answer, response like this. So we said, what is that? They're supposed to be very progressive male theologians, and yet they are so gender blind. They are very gender insensitive. So what we did was one time when we had this meeting in St. John in Geneva, we told all the male theologians, why don't you make a tour of Geneva? Because we women, we have something to do. So we sent them all out to make a tour of Geneva, and we went down to the basement, and it so happened that this was really a kind of dialogue between the ITWOT and First World theologians. So Elizabeth Lorenza was there and all these feminist theologians. And so we said, we would like to have also feminist theologians, but from the perspective of Asian women. So that is how it started, because then they gave us some hints how to do this. And of course, the usual thing is you have to know very well the specific context where you come from. So it means to say that we have to study very well what are the characteristics of Asian society. So that's what we did first. We have to see what are the conflicts, what are the issues, etc. And from there, then we would then say, okay, what is the Word of God telling us about this? The usual theology before us, okay, this is a gospel, and how do you put it into practice? Now it is opposite. That means to say, from now on, we will look at what is happening in society, and then we say, what is the Word of God telling about this? Now, before it was just general, more political, the oppression, the exploitation. And then the thing is that when we really decided to have a feminist theologian, so then we started to analyze how women are also treated in Asia. So that is how we started.
Who were the early Asian feminist theologians that you have worked with?
Yes, I remember Virginia Pabella, if you remember her, and Elizabeth Tapia, who just died, and many others. I remember Lilith Usog, Archiligo.
Were there family reasons or social reasons leading you to develop women's consciousness?
Oh yes, when we realized the situation of women in Asia is very patriarchal. And because I studied Philippine history, now what I found out is that before the Spaniards came to the Philippines, actually men and women were equal. Because our foreparents did not have an idea of virginity. So for them, boy and girl, they are the same. But then what happened? When the Spaniards came to the Philippines, they said, oh my goodness, these women here are so free. They go about everywhere. And because that was not in Spain. In Spain, they were really very, very sheltered and everything. A boyfriend cannot even visit the girlfriend without the mother of the girlfriend still in the same room with them. So when they came to the Philippines, they were so shocked by the freedom of the Filipino woman. So they said, no, we must re-educate. So what did they do? They told the mothers, do you know that women are like crystals? And this crystal, when there is a little bit scratch, then she has no more dignity. Because it's like the woman's essence is virginity. And if you lose virginity, you lose your dignity as a woman. So that is what they taught our mothers. So what happened? So the mothers then said, oh, we should not let our girls go about because they might get raped, etc. So what happened is that, so they became sheltered in the houses and the men were very free. And because they were in the houses, they had to do the housework. So that was really what I call the subordination of women in the Philippines, which was not our characteristics. Because before the Spaniards came, the priests were women.
Oh,
they
wow.
are called babaylan. The babaylan was a priestess, and only women can be priestess, and they connect the heaven, the supernatural, with the world. Later on, when the men wanted to become priests, they had to wear gowns like women. That's very opposite of what we have now, but that is our history. That's why for me, feminist theology, especially in Southeast Asia, is like we are going back to our tradition of the equality between men and women.
How did you begin to learn and write about feminist theology? We were all surprised to hear that your PhD was in linguistic philosophy from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome, Italy.
I studied in Germany too, you know. I studied in Münster, Germany, under Karl Rahner, the famous theologian. And then when I had to make my dissertation, I chose linguistic philosophy because I wanted to, at that time, this is what they call atomism, where what they call language game. There is the scientific language game, there is the poetic language game. But what was happening is that the scientific language game is giving the rules to the religious language. So they said, okay, what is true or false is when you can point to something like this is a telephone, this is. But you say God, where is God? You cannot point to God. So they said religious language is meaningless because it doesn't have something that you can point to. That is the essence of my work. So the title of my work is very funny because you cannot do it in one breath, because the title of my dissertation was The Language Game of Confessing One's Belief, a Wittgensteinian Austinian approach to the linguistic analysis of creedal statements.
Wow. Very sophisticated.
Yeah, what I was trying to say is the scientific language should not dictate on the religious language. So it cannot be falsifiability but that there is going to be in the context of a way of life. In that way of life, there is meaning to religious language. That is all what that book is all about. So then what happened? So there was still at that time, I had no idea of feminist theology. But then I was invited to Geneva. I remember there was a women's desk in Geneva. There was a Filipina who was in charge of organizing seminar. And she organized a seminar in Venice. And there, my talk was on a woman political prisoner. And it's all political, but I was gender blind. But then when I went there, and all these people from Latin America, etc., then they talked about rape, incest, etc. And then I said, why am I making a rally against the soldiers who are raping the political prisoner? Why am I not making a rally against the father who is abusing his own child? So I said to myself, this is really not correct. So I said, when I go home to the Philippines, I will really try to put up a women's organization. And luckily, I met 3 people here who also wanted to do the same thing. So we organized the first, really, because there are some women's organizations, but they do not consider them feminists. But we called ourselves a feminist organization. So I think that was the first feminist organization in the Philippines, called Filipina. And that is when we started to do structural analysis, gender analysis, etc., etc. And that was still not feminist theology. But then, of course, as I told you, after that in Geneva, then we put the two together. I mean to say, we had to tell our lay members, do you know that there is a religious cause of women's oppression? We had to show them that there is a religious root to women's oppression. So that is when we kind of introduced to them our feminist theology.
So later, you co-founded Gabriela. Why did you do so? And what was its mission?
Well, the Gabriela is actually a very secular organization. That was the reason why we did that was because, as I said, there was already the growing feminist consciousness because the Filipinas started it first. Then one day in my school, St. Scholastica's College, when there were already many women's organizations, then we said, let us all come together so that we will see how we can push the women's agenda in the whole political scene. So, oh my goodness, about 100 organizations met in my school. And in that Congress, or whatever you call it, they decided to put up an umbrella organization. They said, let's put up so that we will all be united when we make a call for this, when we make a call for that, all of us are together. And they called that umbrella organization Gabriela because Gabriela Silang is a heroine. She fought the Spaniards during the Spanish time. Actually, she had a husband and Ego was fighting the Spaniards and he died in the battle. So Gabriela, the wife, took over. So, and really with the sword and so forth. So we said, because this is going to be a kind of militant women organization, then we called it Gabriela. Now, of course, later on, we had to make some kind of mnemonic, General Assembly, Binding Women, etc., etc. But actually, it's really a woman's name, Gabriela.
So what did it do? As an umbrella organization, it promotes women's welfare. Was it involved in the People's Power movement?
The thing is that there are different branches. For example, there are the women workers. So the women workers, they have their own issues, the conditions of work in the factory, the salary, wages, etc. Then there are the rural women. Now, in the Philippines, the farmer is the most oppressed group because they do not own the land. They are just tenants. And of course, of the farmers, the women farmers are even more exploited because sometimes they do all the work, even in the fields, and yet they are not called the farmers. They are called the assistants. So again, they have another issue. And then we have the urban poor women living in slum areas with no services, no health care, no nothing. So again, they have their own issues. So they have their own organization. And Gabriela is actually the umbrella organization of all these sectoral organizations. And every March 8th, that's the International Women's Day. And by the way, Cory Aquino, who is actually a graduate of our school, she did not only proclaim March 8th, but she said the whole March will be Women's Month. So even until now, the whole March is Women's Month. And not only that, they made a rule that in all budget of the government, 5% should be spent for women. Although, of course, sometimes they do not understand what that is. So in some barangays or in some places, they use the 5% for beauty contest, which is just the opposite of what it should be. But anyway, there is that 5% that should be used for the education of women, actually, and the whole Women's Month. Gabriela was always, every March 8th, we would march from one part of in the Quezon City circle, as they said, and we marched to Malacanang, the place where the president lives. And all the time, every March 8th, there is a different issue. For example, now, just wages for women workers. Or the next year, it will be land for the landless. So that is what we did. And it was really wonderful. We allowed the men to come in. Because when we had the feminist organization here, we said there are two things that we must be clear about. Number one, that our feminism should be in the context of social transformation. It is not just relationship between men and women. It is very important that there is a social context. So the women's movement is a part of the social transformation. Number two, we are not going to be anti-men because we believe that men are also victims of the socialization. So when we have our march on March 8th, we allowed the men to come with us. Only that we said, you are not going to be in front, okay? You will be at the side or at the back. Only the women are in front. But we did not exclude them. So we feel that that is the distinctive feminist philosophy that we have in the Philippines. One is that it has a social context, and number two, it will not be anti-men.
So you have been fighting for women's rights and women's equality for so many years. And as you can see, right-wing politics is so influential in many parts of the world. And there are some women who said, oh, have we failed? We have been pushing for so long. So what inspired you to keeping on for so many decades, even in the midst of adversities or pushback by the patriarchal powers?
I put up an Institute of Women's Studies, which is up to now. Because what I feel is that although we were in Gabriela, we were very militant, but have we reached women among the poor, the poorest of the poor? No, we haven't reached them. It's only the politically conscious that we have reached. But how about those who do not have any political consciousness? They still are very subordinate to the men. There is still what you call violence against women. Now, that is one thing that was very important to us, to fight against the violence against women. Oh, by the way, just now, we just ended the usual campaign against VOW. That is from November 22 to December 13. And yesterday, we had a whole, what they call this, women's event to close the whole thing. And you know that because we have a Women Crisis Center, where we give counseling to victims of rape, victims of incest, victims of all this. So we have what we call survivors group. Because our intention is from victim, you have to go up to being liberated. And not only that, you have to be advocate. So from victim to survivor and then to being advocate. So that is the trajectory of what we want. And they come all the time when we call for them. We have a growing number of survivors group. So that inspires us because we see that we are helping women fight against violence. It is wonderful to see how when you give them a seminar, and then all of a sudden it's like their eyes were awakened to the fact that they are equal to men. They never believed that before. We said, you are made to the image and likeness of God. Is there a blurred image of God? So there is no blurred image of God. So you are the same clear image of God. That is so liberating to them. And it is so wonderful that, but as I told you, we still have a long way to go. Even that was in 1984. Wow, it is 2025. Can I say that there is no more violence against women? Oh no, there's still a lot. Are there still women who are subordinate? Yes. So I feel that we still have a long way to go.
What is your advice to the next generation of Asian feminist theology?
I think that they have to continue what we have begun. Because it's true, there are certain progress. For example, the Philippines has about 30 laws on women and children. But the thing is, we are very good at making laws. But the implementation is nothing. They think that, oh, we have made the law, so that's it. But is it being implemented? No. So my call to the future, these young people now, I said, you have these laws. Before that, we had no law. But you have this law, so you have really something that you can take and say, this is the law and you have to follow it. They have some kind of advantage that we did not have because at that time we just did it on our own. But now there are all these laws that if they would only study it and let people know about it, then they could do a lot more than we have done.
And what are you currently doing?
Our Institute of Women is still there. And actually, we have already a lot of women who are doing the same thing as we are doing. For example, now, before we had the Women Crisis Center and then we had a shelter. But then when there was no more, because there was a time when there was this fear that the funding that's coming from abroad is going to the New People's Army. They did not anymore give us funding. So then we came into a crisis. You cannot have a shelter without somebody there the whole morning and night, and then the women have to have free board and lodging. We couldn't afford that anymore. We used to call it Lila House. Purple is our women's color. So we called it Purple House. Unfortunately, we had to close it. But yesterday, I told you that when our Women Crisis Center was almost dying, and I said, shall we close it now? And then my board, they said, no, because we need it more. All the former executive directors of the, because it was founded maybe 1985. So they said to us, we will volunteer. So now we have a volunteer executive director who comes only on Saturday. But at least we have the hotline, but we do not have anymore the shelter. So what we do now is we refer it to, because that are mostly for children actually. For women, it's only the Department of Social Welfare. But I am not so very enthusiastic about the work of the Department of Social Welfare. So I still want to dream that one day we will have again a shelter for women.
And what are your hopes for 2026?
Well, as I said, for 2026, actually yesterday when we were talking like this, and I said, what a pity we do not have any more employees because we have no salary. Do you know that while we were eating like this, and there were graduates of St. Scholastica's College who were there at that table, one said, I will give one half salary for a volunteer. And then the one said, I will give the other half. So imagine just yesterday in our circle, we were able to get one who will really stay in our office because we have a beautiful office. And they do not pay because it belongs to St. Scholastica's Priory. And now there is a United Nations ambassador. Her name is Karen Davila. And he is also a very famous broadcaster. Do you know that she partnered with us? I hope for the 2026 is that we can have again a women's shelter.
That's great. Yes, I hope so.
I'm really very happy that you thought of this interview because I really want to spread to everybody that we really have to put an end to violence against women. That is my greatest intention now. There should be no more violence against women. And we are really trying to fight it. And I would like to, because this is universal, it's not only in the Philippines, it's all over the world. How can it happen? How can we have a society that is progressive and democratic when half of the society is being exploited by the other half? And not only that, and that they are victims of violence. I think we should say no to it. And I am also asking the men, please, even though you are men, here in the Philippines, there is a group called Men Against Vow. So I would like to ask you all men, you are listening to the podcast of Kokpilan, please put also your group and say Men Against Vow. And all the women are, of course, against vow. So let us all fight against violence against women. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much. It's so good to connect with you and hear what you are doing. If you like the podcast, please click like, comment, and subscribe. I will see you in the next episode.